Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Dollmaker's Obsession. Holly Arnold always had a fascination with antiques. As a child, her grandmother's old Victorian house on the Isle of Wight was a treasure trove of forgotten relics, each with its own whispered history. Among the dusty heirlooms and weathered furniture, one item captivated Holly's young imagination more than anything else: a porcelain doll. Its face was serene, almost lifelike, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to follow her every move. Her grandmother, Ada, would always find her gazing at the doll, and with a tremor in her voice she would warn, "That doll was made by the Dollmaker. Keep your distance, Holly." Years passed, and Holly grew up, leaving the island for university and eventually settling into a busy life in London. Her visits back to the Isle of Wight became infrequent, especially after her grandmother passed away. However, the pull of the island and the strange allure of that porcelain doll never quite left her. One brisk autumn day, Holly received a letter from her grandmother's solicitor. Ada had left the house to her, and she needed to return to settle the estate. Something inside her, a blend of curiosity and nostalgia, urged her to go back. When Holly arrived at the house, it was as if time had stood still. The same creaking floors, the same musty smell of old wood and lavender, and, of course, the same porcelain doll perched on its pedestal in the parlor. This time, though, it was different. The doll seemed even more lifelike, its eyes more intense, almost as if it recognized her. Holly couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over her. She tried to busy herself with the mundane tasks of sorting through her grandmother's belongings, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the doll. Who was the Dollmaker her grandmother had warned her about? What was it about this doll that felt so wrong? She decided to find out. Digging through her grandmother's old papers, Holly discovered a journal, Ada's diary. Inside, the pages were filled with neat, elegant handwriting, chronicling the history of the house, the family, and, most intriguingly, the legend of the Dollmaker. The Dollmaker, it seemed, was a man named Elias Webb, who had lived on the island in the late 19th century. He was a reclusive figure, rarely seen in public, and known for his uncanny ability to craft lifelike porcelain dolls. His dolls were prized by collectors from across Europe, each one a masterpiece of exquisite detail. But as Holly read further, the tone of the entries darkened. Elias Webb had not always been the Dollmaker. He had once been a respected physician, a man of science and reason, until the death of his beloved wife, Clara. Her passing drove him into a deep despair, and he abandoned his practice, retreating into a secluded workshop, where he began his twisted quest to recreate her beauty in porcelain. At first, his creations were merely remarkable dolls, but as the years passed, they became something more, something terrifying. Webb's obsession grew, his need to perfect his craft consuming him. He sought out the most delicate porcelain, the finest fabrics, and finally, the most realistic eyes that seemed almost too real. Holly shivered as she read on. The entries described how Webb had gone mad, convinced that he could trap the soul of his deceased wife within a doll. The townspeople began to fear him, especially when children started to go missing, only to reappear weeks later, lifeless and pale, with the same hollow, empty expressions as Webb's dolls. One night, in a fit of rage and sorrow, Elias Webb set fire to his workshop, destroying himself and his creations. But not before one doll, the most perfect of them all, had been saved. That doll, Holly realized with a growing sense of dread, was the one sitting in her grandmother's parlor. As she finished the last entry, Holly felt a cold chill run down her spine. The final lines, scrawled in her grandmother's shaky hand, warned of a terrible curse. The doll was not just a piece of art, it was something far more sinister. It was said that the spirit of Elias Webb lived on within the doll, his obsession with perfection never dying, always seeking to claim another's soul. Holly couldn't believe what she was reading, yet something inside her, a gnawing, irrational fear, told her it was true. She needed to get rid of the doll, but as she approached it, the air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The doll's eyes, those glassy, haunting blue eyes, seemed to pulse with a malevolent light. She reached out to pick it up, but as her fingers brushed the cold porcelain, she felt a shock, like a bolt of electricity surging through her arm. She jerked back, her heart pounding in her chest. The doll had moved just a fraction, but enough to make her scream. Desperate, Holly grabbed a blanket and threw it over the doll, then hurried to the phone to call anyone to take it away. But the line was dead, and as she turned back, she saw the blanket had slipped off, revealing the doll once more, its expression twisted into something that resembled a smile. Panic surged through her. She had to get out of the house, away from this cursed thing. But as she rushed toward the door, she felt something cold clasp around her ankle. She looked down to see the doll's tiny hand gripping her, its face now contorted in rage. Holly screamed and kicked, trying to shake it off, but the doll's grip was unnaturally strong. It began to climb up her leg, its porcelain fingers digging into her flesh, leaving trails of blood. She staggered, falling to the floor, and the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the doll's face, inches from hers, its eyes glowing with a malevolent, unholy light. When Holly awoke, she was no longer in her grandmother's house. She was in a dark, cold place, her body stiff and unresponsive. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. She could see, though, and what she saw filled her with horror. She was back in the parlor, but now she was the one on the pedestal, surrounded by darkness. She could see her own reflection in the mirror across the room, a porcelain doll with glassy blue eyes, perfect in every way. And as she sat there, trapped in that porcelain prison, she could feel Elias Webb's presence all around her, his whispers of perfection, of eternal beauty, echoing in her mind. Holly Arnold had become the dollmaker's final masterpiece, and she would never be free. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the world outside remained oblivious to Holly Arnold's fate. The grand old house on the Isle of Wight, once filled with life and memories, was now just another forgotten relic, its windows dark and its doors locked tight. Neighbors whispered about the young woman who had inherited the estate but had seemingly vanished without a trace. But no one dared to enter, not after the stories they'd heard about the dollmaker and his cursed creation. Inside the house, time moved differently. Holly's consciousness, trapped within the delicate confines of her porcelain form, drifted in and out of awareness. She no longer felt hunger or fatigue, but the isolation was maddening. Her thoughts, once vibrant and full of life, had begun to dull, reduced to an endless loop of fear and despair. And yet there was something else, something far worse than the solitude. The presence of Elias Webb lingered in the shadows, a constant, oppressive force that taunted her. She could feel him, not as a physical entity, but as a dark energy that thrummed through the walls, whispering in a language she couldn't understand, a language of the damned. Holly was not alone in her torment. Though she couldn't move or speak, she was painfully aware of the other dolls in the house. They surrounded her, their faces frozen in expressions of serenity, but their eyes, those haunting, lifelike eyes, spoke of untold suffering. Holly could sense their souls trapped like hers, each one a victim of Webb's madness. They were all part of his grotesque collection, each one a failed attempt at resurrecting his lost love. But something was changing. As the days passed, Holly began to notice subtle movements from the other dolls. At first, it was just a flicker of an eyelid, a slight tilt of her head. But soon she could hear them, whispers carried on the stale air, faint and fragmented. They were communicating, plotting. The dolls, it seemed, had a plan. Bound by their shared fate, the spirits trapped within the porcelain shells had grown restless, their collective will merging into something stronger, more desperate. They had been Webb's prisoners for far too long, and now they wanted revenge. Holly didn't know how it was possible, but she could feel their anger, their burning desire for freedom. And slowly that anger began to seep into her own mind, fueling her with a newfound determination. She would not spend eternity as a plaything for a deranged dollmaker. She would find a way to escape, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. One night, the house was engulfed in a fierce storm. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, rattling the old glass panes. Lightning flashed, casting eerie shadows across the parlor where Holly sat on her pedestal. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The storm's energy seemed to seep into the room, invigorating the trapped spirits. She felt it, then a sudden surge of power, as if the very fabric of the house had come alive. The other dolls began to move more freely now, their limbs creaking as they turned toward her. Their eyes locked onto Holly, and she understood. They needed her to lead them, to channel their collective strength. In the depths of her mind, Holly focused all her energy on breaking free. She imagined herself standing, moving, speaking anything to shatter the curse that held her. The other dolls lent their strength, their own wills merging with hers, pushing against the invisible bonds that kept them imprisoned. The air grew thick with electricity as the storm outside raged on. The dolls began to tremble, their porcelain cracking under the strain of their collective effort. Holly could feel the pressure building, the dark presence of Elias Webb growing weaker, losing its grip. With one final, desperate push, Holly unleashed everything she had. A deafening crack echoed through the house as the pedestal beneath her split in two. The porcelain that encased her shattered into 1,000 pieces, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity she could move. She fell to the floor, gasping for breath, her body no longer bound by the porcelain prison. But she wasn't the only one. Around her, the other dolls had broken free as well, their forms collapsing into piles of dust and shards. The spirits that had been trapped within them were finally released, their sighs of relief echoing through the room like a ghostly wind. But the battle wasn't over yet. The house itself seemed to groan in protest, the walls shuddering as Elias Webb's presence fought to reassert itself. Holly could feel him trying to pull her back, to drag her down into the darkness where he still lingered. She staggered to her feet, her mind racing. The journal, her grandmother's journal, had mentioned a way to break the curse completely, but in her panic she struggled to remember. The fire, she realized. Webb had tried to destroy his own creations with fire. It was the only way. With renewed determination, Holly stumbled through the house, gathering anything that would burn, old curtains, dusty furniture, anything she could find. She piled it all in the center of the parlor, the room that had been her prison, and struck a match. The flames caught quickly, hungrily devouring the dry wood and fabric. As the fire grew, Holly could feel Webb's presence weakening, his hold on the house slipping away. But she also knew that she had to act fast. The fire would consume everything, and if she didn't escape now, she would perish with the house. As the flames roared around her, Holly ran for the door, the heat searing her skin. She could feel Webb's presence behind her, a cold, desperate hand reaching out to pull her back. But she was too strong now, her will too fierce. With one final burst of energy, she threw open the door and ran out into the storm. The rain poured down, drenching her as she stumbled away from the house. Behind her, the fire raged, the entire building consumed in a blazing inferno. Holly watched as the flames licked the sky, the heat so intense she could feel it even from a distance. But as the house burned, something incredible happened. The dark, oppressive energy that had clung to the island for so long began to lift. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a great weight had been lifted. Holly knew then that she had done it. She had destroyed Elias Webb, and with him, the curse that had plagued her family for generations. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, Holly collapsed onto the wet ground, watching as the house that had once been her prison crumbled into ash. The storm began to die down, the wind easing into a gentle breeze. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Holly felt a sense of peace. The spirits of the other dolls had been freed, their tortured souls finally at rest. And as Holly lay there, staring up at the sky, she felt them pass by her, their whispers of gratitude carried on the wind. They were free, and so was she. But as she drifted into unconsciousness, Holly couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Something ancient and malevolent, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. Elias Webb was gone, but his madness, his obsession, might never truly die. And somewhere, in the ashes of the house, a single, unbroken shard of porcelain lay buried beneath the rubble, its surface smooth and flawless, its edges sharp as a knife. The Dollmaker's final legacy, waiting patiently for another soul to claim. The end? Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.